Hello, and welcome to today's Praxist Table Talks. My name is Vincent, I'm the founder of Praxia, and today we're going to be discussing Novus Civis. We're going to be describing what that means and the principle of what we call Novus Civis in Latin, or the new citizen in English. And joining me today, I have a member of our leadership council, Cody.
Hello, everyone.
How are you doing today?
Doing fantastic.
I'm glad to hear it. But yes, today we'll be discussing Novus Civis. So in Latin, Novus Civis means the new citizen. And when speaking of anything new in philosophy, what we're really trying to describe is a rebirth or a recreation, something that is qualitatively superior, not necessarily new in the linear sense of time. And it's called Novus Civis because we are orienting from the worldview that civilization is the default here. It's a very religious and I guess you could say metaphysically oriented worldview, in which civilization is understood to be the default, and the animalistic orientation or the animalistic nature of humanity is considered to be a regress or an involution of sorts from this civilizational default. And the reason we call it new citizen or Novus Civis, to give it that little Latin flair, is to signify an initiation of sorts, to signify a raising of the ontological status of the individual to this status of Novus Civis, to be aspiratory, to be the archetypal. And we're going to get into this as the episode goes on. And we're going to give some examples as to what Novus Civis actually would look like as a manifestation of that principle. But before we get into that, do you have any opening statements, Cody?
No, I just want to get right into some of the examples and what we mean in this pseudo-religious conception of or recreation of man, as you will.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, Novus Civis is the archetype. I guess it's the principle of archetypal fulfillment in man. I guess we could start off with a quote. Julius Evola has been quoted by saying that a woman who is perfectly woman is superior to man who is imperfectly man. Just as a farmer who does his job correctly is superior to a king who does his job incorrectly. It ends up something to the sort. But essentially, that quote is the characterizing sentiment of Novus Civis. So Novus Civis is the adherence of the individual to the archetypal. So, in a sense, it is the heroic archetype for those who are dispositioned to be the hero. It is the philosopher king archetype for those who are leaders. It is the noble lord for those who are in that position of authority over I guess you could say what would be akin to peasantry, right? It's that noble aspiratory nature, the nature to strive to be better. And to do this, it would be characterized by a symbolic initiation into something. It would be practicing a certain tradition. It would be going into a martial art, learning a certain skill. It would be fulfilling whatever archetype it is that the individual is dispositioned for. So this means that it would be man's adherence to the archetype of a superior man in a broader sense, and a woman's adherence to the archetype of the superior woman in that sense as well. And really, it does correspond to that idea of the greater and lesser individual that I've been talking about before. Now I've written a few things on the greater individual, and I've spoken a lot about it on this podcast before, so I'm not going to get too into that. But Novus Civis is the adherence to that greater type of individual, and it can be seen in various religious figures, such as even historic and religious figures, such as like Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha. We have some archetypal deities who were not so historic, but more so principled and adapted to time and place, such as Balder and let's see, we have
Gilgamesh and Enkidu.
Yep, Gilgamesh and Enkidu. We have Hercules. And so those are also examples of what we would reference as Novus Civis archetypes as well. And then we do have like regular, real historic figures that we're going to get into as well, and detail why they would be raised to this Novus Civis status of being superior man, or of being initiated, or of participating in a higher order of things. So, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, I guess to retranslate, since I think it's good we have two different ways of seeing things, and to reiterate these points so that everyone can understand it. A good reference point to understand what we're saying is to look at something like the Matrix. For those of you more accustomed to our time and place in the here and now, the pop culture aspiration of the Matrix was to be like a retelling of the Bible, but in this strange transhumanist sort of way, which you can very much see superimposed onto the Matrix through the personal lives of the directors, the Wachowski twins, as they've become trans themselves. And you see this failed ascension for this allegory in them, but a lot of the principles at the core of what they were trying to do with the Matrix is still relevant in what we're trying to build up with Novus Civis. And it is meant to be this aspirational figure, Neo being the one, also Neo being a term for new, just like Novus, and him being this demigod-like figure that transcends both the reality of what do they call the place outside the Matrix? Whatever their word for reality there was, and then
I guess the real world. I don't know.
Now they had some biblical allusion to the name of it, but it doesn't matter. And then the Matrix itself, and he was this in-between character of sorts to bridge those gaps in the world, kind of like how Novus Civis would be this bridge between the absolute spiritual goal of mankind as well as the physical limitations of our earthly existence. And so where they kind of failed in this aspect was going down the modernistic route of things, this digital age, this singularity of sorts on the transhumanist scale. And just off call, Vincent brought up a theory on the Kali Yuga that it's just an infinite regress of matrices themselves that are one civilization getting so technologically advanced that they do transpose themselves into this singularity, and now they are the highest status of creature in this new reality that they've developed, and over time it just devolves and the cycle kicks off again. And that's kind of where the Matrix was going down the road of.
Yeah.
But that's kind of it's more of a, I don't know how to say, like laughing in the face of reality itself, because it's anti-reality in a way. It's this careful construction of an ideal, this, like we keep bringing up, this Hegelian mindset that ignores the physical objectiveness around us and the higher spiritual objectivity around us, and makes just this conception of the mind to be the end-all be-all of what is our transcendent being. And that's the exact wrong way to go down.
Yeah. So I guess the way that the Matrix would kind of correspond to the idea of Novus Civis is the idea of Neo being Novus Civis in a sense. You know, he goes through this this process of awakening, of initiation, if you will. He is, just a normal guy, very conditioned, living in his very conditioned life. What would be the analogy for materialistic? He is essentially all of these things. He's going out to parties and living a very mundane life at the very same time. He's essentially everybody's nobody, right? And he finds this. He gets. I guess he finds out his this prophecy, right, through Morpheus, and gets his life kind of thrown upside down in all these in all these different ways. And he takes that red pill. The analogy has been used so much today, but he takes the red pill to become kind of enlightened, to go through this process of initiation, to which he actually does have to take that jump and believe, and say, I believe in something that is outside of my reality. And so in that way, it does signify a raising of his ontological status to that level of enlightenment, or that level of gnosis that we say, of understanding that there is something else beyond what he considers his temporal reality. And so then he goes through and fulfills the archetype of that heroic character. He goes through the Matrix and essentially completes the checklist of the hero's journey, if you will. But in doing so, he kind of establishes a name for himself. He establishes himself as Neo, and he goes beyond being Neo. And even at the end of the first movie, you can see he is at the very least in tune with the universe more so than he was at the beginning of the movie. You see him like he sees the Matrix for what it is. He sees the code. He sees the walls as they are coded in. And that actually kind of goes back to what I was talking about last episode with the understanding reality as a symbol for something, but that's an aside. But he understands reality for what it is, or at the very least, he understands the Matrix for what it is. And he transcends the Matrix, obviously, and goes and becomes more enlightened or more involved with the world that is outside the Matrix, a higher order of things. And while this might not be literally what we are talking about with Novus Civis, it is what we're talking about figuratively. We're talking about an awakening to something that is higher than man, that is higher than temporal reality, an awareness of a higher order of things, a gnosis, like I said before, a knowledge that is innate, that is intellectually innate, that is innate to the intellect of man, that signifies an order of reality that is beyond temporality. And so Novus Civis would be the fulfillment of that knowledge by the active participation within an archetype, if that makes sense. And it's very vague because it's supposed to be vague, because it's applied to all manner of people. It's applied to,
in all manner of time.
Yeah, in all manner of time. Exactly. So, you have that farmer who is perfectly a farmer. You have that king who is perfectly a king. It's the archetype of those things. And then also, you have this idea of the aspiratory journey. So, like, we use the analogy of climbing a mountain. The goal is not necessarily the peak, but the goal is necessarily the peak, but the goal is not necessarily achieved within life. It's that journey upwards. It's that constant focus upwards. It's that constant, figurative orientation upwards towards the transcendent, towards becoming better, towards taking that one step higher to get to the peak. But Novus Civis is never truly achieved, except for in those few individuals who actually do achieve godhood status, like Jesus Christ himself or something of the sort. And so before we get into him, I would actually like to read a quote here from The Soul of Chivalry, a chapter in Revolt Against the Modern World, which is kind of the same idea of what we're talking about, at the very least with the heroic aspect of things. So he says, to begin with, we must be aware of the difference that existed during the European Middle Ages between the feudal and knightly aristocracy. So the feudal aristocracy on one hand and the knightly one on the other hand. The former was connected to a land and faithfulness to a given prince. Knighthood, instead, appeared as a super-territorial and supranational community in which its members, who were consecrated to military priesthood, no longer had a homeland and thus were bound by faithfulness not to people, but on the one hand to an ethics that had as its fundamental values honor, truth, courage, and loyalty, and on the other hand to a spiritual authority of a universal type. So that's kind of what we're talking about with Novus Civis here, is that second type of aristocracy, if you will. It's that knighthood aristocracy, where we are bound to fundamental truths and also to a spiritual authority that is higher than ourselves as man.
it's kind of like the platonic form of the ideal man in a way.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the ways in which this has been manifest throughout history is obviously within religious figures who have achieved that type of godhood status, or that deification. You have the Trinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and so Jesus is obviously the Son.
Before we get into that, there was a distinction that I wanted to make, going a little bit back to the Matrix. I just had to gather my thoughts.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
With that idea of the Neo taking the red pill, that's one of the indications of the failure of the Wachowskis or Wachowskis, however you pronounce their name, twins, in the direction of this revelation, this epiphany that Neo gets in seeing the world for what it is. There isn't an external MacGuffin that you take that will reveal you to the world. I get that the metaphor is meant to just be the choice of pursuing that truth, and the blue pill would be choosing to just ignore reality and go back into a state of dreamless sort of slumber. But it is presented as this material trans-like taking of a pill, that this sort of neurochemical reaction that will make you see beyond what's already in front of you. Whereas what we're kind of getting at is this divine spirit that already was, or that always was, like as what Vincent's about to get into with like a Jesus-like figure, or in a gradual overcoming of reality itself, like a Bronze Age pervert's sort of conception of the animal mastering his environment, or how would you say? I had another example. Excuse my lapse in thought, but as I think of that, I won't interrupt again. Vincent, you take it away.
Oh no, you're good. Actually, you bring up a good point, because where I was going down with that avenue with Jesus, you are correct. Novus Civis, the Novus Civis principle is not necessarily, it's a different worldview of time. Really, it's a different understanding of the order in which we are participating in, the order of things that we're participating in. You mentioned that as Neo would take this pill, it's signifying that like transhumanist, change of being, where he truly does change as a being himself, as a physical body, by becoming this technological, or this I guess the return from technology, I guess you could say, from this transhumanist state. But really this is signified by a progression in time that is very linear. It's future focused and future oriented, whereas Novus Civis is intended to be designed for the eternal now, if that makes sense. It's supposed to be this timeless conception beyond all contingency of the archetypal, which goes as far as the human characteristics can possibly go, as far as humanly archetypes can possibly go. So where it's not becoming something that you are it's not creating something new that you are destined to become. It is raising yourself to that status of always was. It's participating in the eternal now. It's participating in an order of principles that extend beyond history, if that makes sense. So like I was bringing up Jesus and being God. It's not necessarily that Jesus is principally how would you say? I guess like conditioned to one time and place, but
he's a different categorization of Novus Civis.
Yeah,
we could say.
Yeah,
which is what I was trying to delineate.
Yeah, but the idea of Jesus is one that extends prior to and after his death, in various cases. You could also find figures like Noah, or those who heed a divine word, and understand it and interpret it, to be of a Novus Civis archetype as well. One who puts duty above all else, duty and faithfulness to things that are beyond the self, beyond the material conditionings of even things like homeland, of personhood, or of what would be usually characterized as some type of individuality or individual expression. Casting all of that off, all of that regalia as material itself, and orienting towards this one single purpose of fulfilling the archetype, of fulfilling the function. That excuse me, that is what Novus Civis truly is. There was something else I was going to mention on your matrix thing, but if you remember it again, we can go back into it. But it's interesting to go into the different religions and different historical interpretations and traditions and things like that, and figure, and I guess observe how this principle of Novus Civis, which is truly common across all religions and spiritual traditions and whatnot, how this becomes interpreted throughout their scripture. I guess we can talk a little bit about, so I will outline this as well. There are, generally speaking, two orders to interpreting, the divine and perennial concepts such as what we would call Novus Civis, what some traditions would call superior man and greater man and whatnot. There's the esoteric understanding of that holistic principle, which is that, again, that participation in the eternal now, that understanding of function beyond form, of a principle that exists wholly in its metaphysical fashion, beyond all temporal contingency and whatnot. And then there's that exoteric tradition, which is those principles conditioned and adapted to time and place. And these figures of Novus Civis who we look to in history are adaptations of that one principle which exists forever. It's the Jesus principle. It's the greater man principle. It's the the Hercules principle or whatnot. These are various, not expressions, but manifestations of this principle within certain contexts and certain times and places. That's how we view this idea. So I do want to. I guess
another way to iterate that, though, too, is to have this idea that there are the objective always was type of divine figures that are the higher being, beyond that which man is capable of achieving through effort. It's just something innate in quality in their very existence, like Jesus, because he was this figure of divinity, born of a divine right. But that's not to say that this aspirational aspect isn't still far exceeding the average man, and by great margins too, where, as we're going to get into, the historic figures that reach up and nearly touch that Novus Civis status, but because they are just men, then they obviously can't be what is this divinely aspirational thing. It's like a Nietzschean will to power almost, where it's this overcoming of the lesser qualities of yourself and our lesser natures as men, to approximate the divine within a physical reality.
Yeah. It is that always was. It really is difficult to try to explain in any less abstract terms than I'm describing them in now, to really capture that holistic principle of what we're talking about here. But I do want to stress that Novus Civis is I guess it's a conception which has three characteristics to it. It is eternal, it is timeless, and it is perennial, universal, and it is absolute. And so it is. With that being said, in a principle form, Novus Civis is that one single archetype of it. It's the archetype of adhering to the archetype, if that makes sense. It really is that above all, always was framework.
It's that symbol that manifests the essence of the thing.
Yeah.
We talked about in the previous episode.
Exactly. And then to be Novus Civis, or to aspire to be Novus Civis, is to aspire to participate as a citizen within that greater order of things. we talked about civilization being the default, so I guess I will expound a little bit upon that before we get into Jesus as well. It's contrasting from the Hobbesian or from the Lockean, or really of the post-Enlightenment thinkers.
The Enlightenment, yeah.
Yeah, the Darwinistic figures as well. Contrasting from their understanding that civilization is the end product of humanity getting smarter and smarter. And that is why various arguments are made that civilization necessarily needs to exist, or that an authoritative civilizational structure, such as a state or as a caste system or whatever, needs to exist because of that evolution, and because of that constant increase in the intellect of man. What Novus Civis signifies is civilization being the default, and from any derivation or deviation, any departure from this default is an involution. It is a decrease in the qualitative value of man. It's a decrease in his intellect. It's a lesser understanding, and this does correspond with that worldview in which man is. It does correspond with the cyclic worldview of time. That worldview in which man is considered to have undergone an involutive process, I guess you could say.
It's like comparing us now to those Atlantean hyper-civilizations of prehistory.
Yes, exactly. And so the idea is that with civilization being the default, to participate in it, if you are of this animalistic orientation, or this animalistic origin of which modern man necessarily is now, there needs to be a type of investiture of the archetypal within man today. And so it is essentially the opposite of this Hobbesian, of this post-Enlightenment and Darwinistic worldview of civilization being the end goal, or the end product, and contrasting it with something that is a worldview in which civilization is the default and the always was and always should be type of deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But yes, different religious teachings and different civilizations and all of that have different ideas of this Novus Civis, of this new citizen, of this initiated individual, of this enlightened being. The excerpt I read was from a text I'll probably further dive into as we talk about this topic, when we go into how Novus Civis truly functions, and how the exoteric tradition kind of emphasizes certain attributes of this Novus Civis. But for now, we'll talk about the main ones right here. But even within the same religious sects, or like the same religions or the same traditions, with the various sects that appear, there are different interpretations of what Novus Civis would truly mean in a fulfilled and holistic sense. And so Jesus is one of those individuals with whom, we are probably most familiar with, especially being Westerners. He is that archetypal figure of being the Son of God, of being divine incarnate, of one of the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The manifestation of that divine principle of Novus Civis, or the superior man, and the archetype to which lesser man, or more conditioned man, such as we are, should need to adhere. The same thing with Muhammad, but I'll get into him a little bit later. But the idea of Jesus, the idea of being Christ-like, is at the center of Christian doctrine. We have the idea of adhering to the, prerequisites that were set forth by Jesus to be that type of man. So to be Christ-like is, I guess you could say, the end goal of Christian dogma. But what is being Christ-like, right? That's kind of what we're trying to discuss here in this episode, is what is being Novus Civis? What is being Christ-like? And so various teachings exist as you go throughout the various, I guess you could say, derivations of Christianity, or the different results that came about after that, proto-Orthodox period of Christianity, like the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Protestant Church, and all of these various churches. And even the Gnostic movement, which I kind of want to get into as well, arose, all interpreting not only the Word of God, but propounding a dogma that, I guess you could say, commands the individual, or at the very least orients the individual towards this Christ-like life. And so the way in which it's defined is a little bit different in each path. So we can go through, I guess you can say, the normal proto-Orthodox interpretation of Christianity, or interpretation of Jesus, and then go from there. Does that sound good to you?
Yeah.
Okay. So, excuse me. So the proto-Orthodox Christians, I'm taking this from a website here, by the way. I have an article up, but the proto-Orthodox Christians believed that Jesus Christ had been fully human and fully divine, and that these two natures were inseparably intertwined within him. As we'll explore more in depth shortly, the proto-Orthodox justified this view by arguing that it was necessary for Jesus to fully suffer as a human in order for his crucifixion and resurrection to be effective in bringing salvation to humanity. So that's the archetype in which Jesus exists. He exists to fulfill that sacrifice to cleanse man of his sins, if that makes sense. So it is the utmost duty. And then it goes on to say the Gnostics and some other early Christians as well took issue with this view, and implied that Christ's spirit was under the power of matter and that it suffered at the hands of matter, which seemed ridiculous and even blasphemous to them. How could a perfect spirit, the Spirit of God no less, suffer? For the Gnostics, the proto-Orthodox view made a mockery of Christ's perfection and power. And so then they said, how could Christ have come into this world, without being comprised by the world, without being of material? And so, essentially, that's where the derivation occurs within them. So as you can see, it's this very exoteric, formal differentiation between two interpretations of the same principle. That's kind of what I wanted to get at by going into here.
And as a contemporary example of that, Owen Benjamin is a bit of a Gnostic in that regard, because he does struggle with and has had many heated debates and discussions within his own community on Trinitarianism versus this idea of fulfilling God's law and Jesus being this divine figure, that how could he suffer at the hands of physical mortal men if he is inherently this divine person.
Right.
And it is a question worth struggling over, because it seems contradictory in the light of it. But the easy way I kind of get around it, and that's not necessarily say it's the right way, but approaching that is when you're dealing with a being that is in essence reality itself, like God himself, and imbuing his soul into a physical human body, it doesn't necessarily work on the same spectrum of logic or material consequence that the rest of us are bound by. So that's just to put that there to maybe ease into that discussion.
Well, yeah, I actually kind of want to pick your brain at that a little bit more. What do you mean exactly?
So one of the funny ways that Owen Benjamin put it is that you're essentially saying that this tribe killed God. How can you kill God? He's God. And he has had a bit more of a spin to that to make it a little more comedic, played up for the audience and things. But
Right.
It does strike at that fundamental question of like, well, if it is this divine being, us mere mortals can't harm him. But then you go, well, again, he's not playing by the same rules, because there has to be some interface with physical reality if Jesus is to be wholly a man and also wholly divine.
Right.
So you can't play by the same rule book as the normal person is bound by in that case, especially when you're dealing with the creator and essence of all existence in the first place.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, I guess the best way to look at it would be to see it as a fulfillment of a plan. It can't necessarily be, I don't know, I feel like looking at it too focused in that, like I feel like looking at it very focused, like in a very focused manner, kind of deters from the point that's being made. Whether or not he was God or whether or not he was a man who was the son of God, the result is the same in the sense that he played out this divine prophecy of fulfilling
of atonement.
Yeah, fulfilling the sacrifice and whatnot. But that is an interesting way to look at it.
Oh, sorry, you wanted to finish?
I was just saying that is an interesting way to look at it. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's just that's the best way to try and grapple with this religious category of Novus Civis too, because you are dealing with these are the figures to look at as the aspirational top in our physical reality. Obviously, there exist things beyond just the physicality of the world, the supernatural and the sort of esoteric realms of things, the mathematical aspect of things that have no real physical basis but are still true in reality. And dealing with these beings of divinity, you can't hold man to that same standard. That's why there's this different categorization. That's why they are the top of it that can exist within the physical space of reality itself. Right. Otherwise, then you get into this tearing apart of physical reality as the divine kind of breaches and broaches it. That's why the war in heaven and hell is something that we don't see in everyday life, and why that conception of atheists, so let me speak to your God personally, is so shallow and missing the point of that
right.
Ordeal.
Right. It's asking to speak to that cosmic superhero rather than trying to understand a single fundamental principle, right? And what we're really getting at here with our worldview is trying to understand the way in which that single fundamental principle or prime mover or the monad, the way in which that interacts within itself, within every being that exists. It's essentially the quality of existence itself. But yeah, that is interesting.
It'd be like trying to communicate with the fundamental theorem of mathematics.
Yeah.
And it's like, we know it's real because we can utilize it to interface with the physical phenomena we see, and it has a relationship there, but it is something that has no actual physical conception itself. It is an abstraction that we didn't even create, that we've more or less discovered through those phenomena and interactions with the world. And that's why we just see the sliver of reality through the physical world.
Right.
And why we're so error driven, and why that idea of the Platonic form is very important, because reality is unreliable, or the physical reality is unreliable in that aspect, but there does exist this state beyond where there are the perfect form of all things, and that's where someone like Jesus would exist. Yeah,
exactly. And so for those who are not really familiar with the Platonic form or Platonic realism, it's this idea of it's this idea of an order of objectivity, of a perennial objectivity that exists outside of of humanity's minds, if that makes sense. It's essentially the idea of participation within a monistic and singular order to reality that is objective, regardless of the subjective viewpoints by which it may be viewed within, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the classic way of explaining it in simplest terms is like looking at a table or a chair. There are many things that can be utilized as a table or a chair, and different characteristics of them that you can describe and list. And it gets dicey because you can describe something like a horse as a chair or as a table itself, depending on how you form those characteristics. But we know that a horse is not a chair or a table, and we know what chairs and tables are implicitly by the summation of their characteristics. They are greater than the sum of their parts. And so in this Platonic form, there exists something that is a perfect chair or a perfect table, from which all other forms of tables and chairs kind of derived from. They are both the simplest and most perfect form of any of these categorizations.
Yeah, exactly. And so that would be what Novus Civis is to man. It is the There are many men. There are many things that can be classified or quantified or qualified as a man. But what we're looking at is the highest point of reference to man, or the highest reference point that man can achieve, or at the very least look to as inspiration to achieve the highest point possible to him in his given conditioned circumstances. You know, it's a very broad topic.
And that's why it's hard for this discussion to kind of take place, because by its very essence, it can't exist in physical reality without kind of tearing apart existence in its whole, in a sense, to have it manifest in some physical form. And even then, we probably wouldn't understand it, because we wouldn't know how to interact with it, because it is a non-physical thing, even if there was some physical way to interface with it or observe it or sense it. It's very weird, but if you take what we're saying and think about it for a little bit, it'll start to make sense.
Yeah, it is this idea of, again, it's the idea of the archetypal. It's the idea of adhering to the it's that idea of the spontaneous alignment of the humanly principle with the superhuman principle, or the idea of a divine man, or of the divine nature within man, of being initiated or something like that. Which reminds me, let me pull something up here. Where are we at? All right, here we go. So I wrote something for the idea of Novus Civis as well, which I'm kind of expanding upon as we talk about this principle. But to, I guess, get the point across, I wrote the principle of Novus Civis is the quote unquote ideal praxis individual. Praxis being the way in which that monad operates within himself, or the participation within that monad through the way in which you are qualified to participate in it. Praxis being that putting into action these divine truths and principles, the spontaneous alignment of your principle with the quintessential truth, all of that stuff, all of these very broad abstractions. That is what we would consider the ideal praxis individual, or the Novus Civis. It's a universal understanding of being the greater individual and fulfilling one's distinct purpose. So it's, Latin for new citizen, denoting one's duty to become a better version of themselves and align their personal principles with the quintessential truth of their given civilization, which is the default, and to participate and provide in a superpersonal order in which their personal function and purpose is truly realized. And so I go on to say that the greater individual and lesser individual are terms used to describe superpersonal versus subpersonal individual and collective identities and functions. And so these terms, greater individual and lesser individual, they carry a double meaning on the macro and micro scales. On the one hand, they can mean something like a superior caste versus a lesser caste. But on the micro scale, this is what we're looking at for Novus Civis, that individual personal principle. The lesser individual is generally characterized by consumption and a cyclic participation in a more materially oriented social and individual action. And they might claim a type of individuality that separates them from, quote unquote, the masses, but this individuality is usually something within the realm of popularity or comfort and is very similar to other people's characterizations of that same individuality. So that lesser individual would not be that Novus Civis just yet. They would be part of the masses. They would be uninitiated and participate in the order of ideas or in the order of like functions and operations and things like that that correspond to materialistic orientations. And then the greater individual, rather than being one of consumption, is one of assumption, who rejects anything other than that which either holistically originates within them or from the higher order in which they participate. They reject that from being part of their identity. Or they assume that higher order within their identity, and then they reject all materialistic and external impositions from their identity. And so the ideal individual, the Novus Civis, is one who renounces the material conditionings and chthonic influences of nature and the body, and embraces the divine and supernatural elements of the spirit which take form in the body. The Novus Civis is not one of a specific caste, but one who assumes the duties and identities of whatever caste to which they were preordained. Not one of a specific sex, but one who assumes the duty of the sex to which they were preordained. Not a specific nation or people, but one who assumes the ideal character of any nation or people of which they are a part, and rejects the constructed characteristics of impropriety and so on. And so the Novus Civis is generally characterized as possessing an inner volition and discipline. This is the great test of man and the Praxist orientation, to renounce all temporal influences of pain and of pleasure, and to seek a spiritual actualization and self-fulfillment through discipline and eventual mastery of a given path, and most importantly, a given duty. Thus, Novus Civis is the universal aspiration to orient towards the divinity within man, rejecting consumption and materialism in as far as it is detrimental to the character of the person, with the preceding rebirth into this new path through that renunciation, or that initiation as well. So that's essentially what I wrote to, I guess, wrap up the true principle of what we're talking about here in the most concise terms.
And if that all does sound familiar, which in the first half especially it did, but the second half it deviates from, it does sound much like Nietzsche's conception of the Übermensch and the Untermensch. And that's no coincidence there. That's not to say we're ripping off Nietzsche, but we're coming to the same conclusions sort of independently on overcoming our inherent evils, so to speak, or overcoming our lesser natures. And they exist kind of uniquely within all different groups of peoples, and there's different expressions of the Novus Civis across different cultural and national bounds that can be manifested through this conception. And the point where we deviate most on that is that we're not announcing the death of God, in that man has to overcome this lack of a spiritual foundation in the world, but rather embracing that God always is and was, and resisting the degradation of society around us, rejecting that notion and falling into the nihilism that Nietzsche wanted to save everyone from.
Yeah.
And so,
go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
That on the specific parts with it being manifest in different peoples or places or times and things like that, all men have a lower nature we resist. There's this animalistic quality to us, or rather than call it an animalistic quality, it's a domesticated quality, devolved outside of the civilization we're meant for, which kind of, we'll get into that with the Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Enkidu? That's how you pronounce it again? I always mess up his name. Yeah. With Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and their dichotomy sort of exemplifying that even as far back as ancient Sumeria. But men and women likewise have their respective ideals to manifest and to actualize. That's why we use Novus Civis, because it is a sort of unisex term, to not put on the shoulders of civilization just one sex over the other, whereas it's always been a cooperative effort. And in recent decades, it's been this subverting of those norms and subverting of those predestinations that we're all born into. And so now we have men and women not fulfilling the roles that they are meant to as men and women, as their ideal form of the sex they were born as, even going so far as to reject it and become the opposite, or claim that they are something third and other altogether.
Yeah. And this claimant of being that third or other, we talk a lot of androgeneity and things like that. And it does seem to be that reawakening of that androgynous, or that desire to be that androgynous being, that superhuman or primordial being beyond caste, beyond sex, beyond everything. But the way in which it's gone about is a materialistic manner that it kind of lowers the individual down into that materialistic sphere, defining these two things as they are manifested by various hormonal interactions and neurological interactions, defining these things as they are quantitatively based. You can see the various, you can measure the various chemicals within one's brain, all of these things which are the results of the various metaphysical impositions of the sex, rather than defining them based on the qualitative value of which androgeneity is supposed to assume. It's supposed to be beyond man, whereas the way in which it is scientifically gone about now, or scientifically understood now, is kind of sub both of these principles here. And that's what we're trying to...
And that's why I brought up the Matrix too, because the Matrix kind of exemplifies that as the failure of that transcendent narrative on those same grounds.
Yeah, exactly. It's a I guess you could say it's a case of almost hitting the nail on the head, but missing it a little bit and bending that nail. It's very similar in the principles which are trying to be adhered to, but the way in which it's gone about is what matters here. And if it's gone about in a materialistic fashion, it can only have a materialistic end. It is by renouncing those material shackles and by truly embracing one's inner nature, which has a whole bunch of correspondences, that one can truly be Novus Civis. One can truly be themselves. What kind of, I guess you could say, what kind of correlates to this idea is, there's this idea of man's consciousness being, it's kind of within the same order of ideas that we're talking about, being almost hitting the nail on the head, almost hitting the mark. There's this idea of man's consciousness being separate from his body. It's that disconnect of mind and body, which came about during around the same time as the Enlightenment, which kind of sticks here until today, with this idea of mind being separate from even dispositions like sex and things like that, various preordainments and whatnot. What the difference between our worldview and this worldview of disconnect is that there is a reason for everything in our worldview, and so mind, or body, I guess you could say, because it's the most materialistic aspect, corresponds to mind, which corresponds to intellect, which corresponds to caste, which corresponds to some other superhuman principle, which all goes back and lineates towards the absolute, or that monad. Whereas in the relativistic worldview, in which mind is separate from body, there's this idea of a disconnect between everything and reality. There's no lineage to trace back towards a most fundamental principle. There are just various things which exist, which are perhaps sometimes encapsulated and affected by other things, but do not wholly relate to the thing in which they are encapsulated. And that's the mindset we're trying to avoid here. We're trying to understand reality as it functionally and purposely is, rather than as something which is accidental, which we can get into later. But that's the idea of where Novus Civis aligns with the human principle, is by aligning all of these principles with this continuity, this traceable continuity back to the monad, the quintessential truth, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly. And using that same mentality and applying those principles consistently, you could use that to overcome these ideas of racial division as well. And we'll get into a second on the different expressions throughout different historical figures that are from all different times, places, ethnic and racial origins that do exemplify this Novus Civis, and how each separate ethnic or racial background isn't something to be wholly discriminated against or obsessed over in some detrimental way, because that ultimately leads to conflicts of genocide or eradication or even self-destruction in various different forms.
Yeah.
And you got to apply these same principles, and like what Vincent just laid out and what I'm getting at as well, that all people have the potential to manifest this ideal form, that which they were born into, and can overcome their lower natures. And some of those lower natures are unique to different racial or ethnic groups, or culturally relative stigmas and perceptions, I guess you could say. And so it's overcoming each of those barriers that are unique to any person at any given time in any different place of the world, that then can transcend and look across the aisle and see the great men of civilization kind of shoulder to shoulder. And looking all throughout history, and even in the modern day, you can see the great men who arise regardless of where they came from, or if they were fighting against each other or alongside each other. These great men could kind of have that recognition of, oh, we're alike in many ways. We're aiming towards that transcendent quality. Even if they don't have the words to describe it, there's this implicit sort of recognition of something beyond just the cultures they come from.
Yeah. And there were two figures actually that I was going to mention later on, which kind of exemplify what you're talking about as well, with that bridging of the racial and ethnic divides, as well as the mutual understanding of great men in history. I brought them up before, but they kind of have more relevance here, so we'll get into that too.
We can get right into those examples now.
Well, actually, I was kind of just going to sum up with Jesus a little bit, because we have, there were two interpretations that I kind of wanted to get into, which kind of signify or exemplify, I guess you could say, how different Novus Civis can be just by two interpretations of the same group, divided across certain lines, while still not losing any of its holistic element to it, if that makes sense. But before I get into that, the first thing I want to do is, there's what you were reading, or what you were saying there actually reminds me of this passage here, which I wanted to read. So let's go here. Generally speaking, and especially in typically Aryan civilizations, and when we speak of like Aryan in that sense, we're talking of the heroic principle. We're not talking about the mid-century definition that word was given by certain political groups.
Just curious, are you quote reading something, or is this your own words?
Quote reading. Quote reading.
Oh, what is it?
Evola again is the same book.
Okay.
But generally speaking, and typically in Aryan civilizations, there were long periods of time in which a remarkable degree of pluralism existed within every state or city. Families, stocks, and gents made up many small-scale states and powers that enjoyed autonomy to a large degree. They were subsumed in an ideal and organic unity, though they possessed everything they needed for their material and spiritual life: a cult, a law, a land, and a militia. Tradition, the common origin, and the common race, not just the race of the body but the race of the spirit, were the only foundations of a superior organization that was capable of developing into the form of the empire, especially when the original groups or forces spread into a larger space when it needed to be organized and unified. A typical example of this is the early history of the Franks. Frank was synonymous with being free, and the bearer, by virtue of one's race, of a dignity that in their own eyes made the Franks superior to all people. Up to the 9th century, sharing the common civilization of and belonging to the Frank stock were the foundations of the state, although there was no organized and centralized political unity coextensive with a national territory as the modern idea of a state. Later on, in the Carolingian development that led to the establishment of the empire, Frank nobility was scattered everywhere. These separated and highly autonomous units, which still retained an immaterial connection with the center, constituted the unifying vital element within the overall connection, like cells of the nervous system in relation to the rest of the organism. The Far Eastern tradition in particular, so like Eastern Asia and stuff like that, has emphasized the idea that by leaving the peripheral domain, by not intervening in a direct way, and by remaining in the essential spirituality of the center, like the hub of the wheel affecting its movement, it is possible to achieve the virtue that characterizes the true empire. As the single individuals maintain the feeling of being free and everything unfolds in an orderly way. This is possible because by the virtue of the reciprocal compensation resulting from the indivisible direction being followed. The partial orders or individual wills will eventually contribute to the overall order. This is the basic idea behind any real unity or any authentic authority. On the contrary, wherever we witness in history the triumph of a sovereignty and of a unity presiding over multiplicity in a merely material, direct, and political way, intervening everywhere, abolishing the autonomy of single groups, leveling in an absolutist fashion every right and every privilege, and altering and imposing a common will on various ethnic groups, then there cannot be any authentic imperial power, since what we're dealing with is no longer an organism, but a mechanism. This type is best represented by modern national and centralizing states. So what he's speaking of here is what you were exactly talking about with the whole idea of this Novus Civis principle preceding and being expressed by various races, and then at the instance in which these are no longer unique or individual, and when they're leveled to the degree of being qualitatively the same, at least in the eyes of an imposing force, that is when they can no longer be expressed properly. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I will have to go give that a re-listen again, but
yeah, it's
from what I did gather, yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very long-winded point to make, but regardless, kind of closing up on Jesus, and we can move into like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, because that's a good duo. Then we can move into some historical figures, and then we can kind of wrap up. But we can also, there's one more thing to talk about with how we actually implement this into our daily lives. But
I got that, but that's towards the end.
Yeah, but that's with Jesus himself being interpreted in these various ways. I described the duality between the proto-Orthodox and the Gnostic, and the proto-Orthodox really did develop into these different churches that we have today. So most of these churches share the same view of Christ as the proto-Orthodox did, obviously in a very differentiated manner, and it really does deserve more research than I've allowed to be put into this as a whole. But the differentiating aspect of it was that the proto-Orthodox people viewed Jesus as a personality archetype, which I would say is an archetype of a lesser sense, where it's the love thy neighbor. It's the common things that characterize the Christian understanding of Christ today. It's the love thy neighbor, love thy enemy, be kind, not just like the in the vague sense, but like be a kind and caring person to show a will to enlighten people, be faithful, all of these various virtues. But overall, it's be obedient to the word of Christ and to the word of God. That's the idea of the proto-Orthodox understanding of being Christ-like. But to the Gnostics, being Christ-like is much different. All of the aforementioned parameters still apply, but to the Gnostics, it also means to achieve gnosis. Their name implies being Gnostic. It implies not to obey the word of God, but to understand the word of God. Not to adhere to a certain dogma for the sake of dogma and for, you would say, like political or social stability, but to understand the why behind that dogma, to question everything. You see, to be Christ-like, Christ himself reformed a whole religion of, he reformed Judaism into Christianity by his ability to understand, by his gnosis. And so to the Gnostics, to be Christ-like means to want to achieve that same status of understanding, of knowledge, of questioning the necessary authorities of, questioning the necessary temporal authorities on spiritual matters. And so that to them is what being Christ-like is like. And the reason I bring these up is because these two examples of what being Christ-like is like are essentially very different, but in a sense still one and the same. They both have that Novus Civis always was super personal, archetypal idea to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like the man who follows the law without question can be considered a good man, but one who truly understands the law could be considered a lawyer.
Yes, exactly.
Or beyond that, a judge of sorts, because they would obviously follow and understand why it's necessary to follow these principles. But the person that just follows it blindly or obediently, as functional as they may be within the system, lacks a certain autonomy and how would you say?
They are very characteristic of a collective. They go back into the totem, so to speak.
The NPCs, if you will.
Yeah. But yeah, it is very much about understanding and whatnot. And so, you know how I said earlier that the greater and lesser individual can be characterized on the micro and the macro scales, where Novus Civis is really focused on that micro scale, that personal scale. On the macro scale, these two implementations of this same principle are directed at various groups. One for the initiated, one for the exoteric, the ones who kind of don't need to understand because they can't understand, but they still need to obey. There's that proto-Orthodox understanding. And then for the ones who do understand, for that priestly caste, for that very select few of individuals to whom Jesus Christ's words mean many different things and not just the explicit literal meaning of what he's saying, that there is that Gnostic interpretation for them. So it's two different ways of looking at the same principle.
Yeah, and it's even present in when I think it's in Matthew. Christ was questioned why he speaks in parables, and he said just very bluntly, because as true as everything I'm saying is, saying it bluntly or speaking in parables wouldn't make a difference because only a few are meant to understand it, truly understand it, and that's what puts them above the average man.
Yes, I actually have that verse up right here. And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables? He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy, which saith, by hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see, but not perceive. So it's essentially that understanding of what I'm saying. Basically, what he's saying is, what I'm saying has 5 meanings to it. Not everyone is going to understand, but that few of that with the disposition to understand and to research and to really truly have that intellectual
it's seeing the code of the matrix itself, and those people will get it and perceive it through the parables. Just like I think we brought this up last episode too with Nostradamus and his predictions, and only a few will understand them as history goes on.
Sorry if you can hear that. There's like a lawnmower outside. I don't know what's going on outside, but
don't even worry about it.
Yeah, here we'll let it pass. You can very well hear it on the recording. All right, here we are. So yeah, it's that idea of being of understanding that things have a higher order to them, a deeper meaning to them. It is that intuition innate to the intellect. That was the word that I was looking for before. But it is interesting to look at these two interpretations of Jesus and see within them these various characteristics. Moving on, though, there is another myth. It is the I forget. It's the somewhere in the Middle East. It was one of the Mesopotamian civilizations. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first mythology, and it signifies a hero, I guess you could say, who starts off as kind of an anti-hero of Gilgamesh and his partner Enkidu. And the way in which they contrast from each other is, and even kind of correspond with each other, is signifying two various aspects of this Novus Civis individual. So Gilgamesh is supposed to be. He begins as this king, who essentially is very not a very good ruler. He's abusive towards his people. He is your quintessential not evil. He wasn't evil, but he was a very brash and abrasive ruler, I guess you could say.
Didn't quite know how to rule.
Yeah. So the citizens, they turn against him, and they kind of complain and whatnot. And so the goddess Aruru, I believe is how it's pronounced, creates this being called Enkidu, which is essentially a primordial type of being that is very not materialistic, but in a sense
naturalistic.
Yeah,
in a sense.
Yeah.
His Bizarro.
Yeah.
Where Gilgamesh is meant to be this type of proto Arthurian king-like figure, and then kind of becomes it. He's this civilized man.
Yeah.
But from Enkidu's perspective, he's domesticated. And from Gilgamesh's perspective, Enkidu, which is supposed to be this free and wild spirit, but his equal in every regard, from Gilgamesh's perspective, he's nothing but a wild beast.
Right.
Even though he's in tune with nature and at peace with it, and most comfortable in this realm. And so then they kind of fight it out and then realize, oh, we're both kind of great. We shouldn't fight all that much, and spurs on the trials of Gilgamesh into him actualizing the spirit of Novus Civis and becoming the great ruler he's meant to be, and not screwing up the position of his throne.
Exactly. And so one of the ways I think that this is that this can best be interpreted is by understanding that this is it's a symbol of the dichotomy between what is naturalistic and what is more divine. We have Gilgamesh being that representation of Novus Civis as that civilizational default, where he does still exist in that uninitiated and lower state by being that, very abrasive and not unqualified but underqualified ruler, who needs to be raised to that status of like God King or Priest King or whatever you may want to signify it as. Whereas you also have Enkidu as this Novus Civis type individual by being very heroic, by dedicating himself to this super personal cause, the cause for which he was created specifically to go and defeat Gilgamesh, but also to, once this was achieved, understand his place in the order of things with Gilgamesh as his partner. And if you look at it more holistically, it seems to be that Enkidu wasn't created to kill Gilgamesh or to get rid of him, but to enlighten him. And so this dichotomy was created of two individuals who are two halves of a whole. And then once they have, in a sense, corresponded with each other, they both create this singular divine being within each other. They signify the gaps left within the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it also demonstrates other aspects about civilization as well, because Enkidu finds a citizen of Gilgamesh's kingdom, and he falls in love with her. And in this process of her and him interacting with each other, the natural environment in which he lived out in the forest outside of the kingdom slowly started to reject him as he became domesticated by women. And that's kind of the principal aspect of women all throughout civilization, is that to keep men from being both destructive internally and externally, they come in and pacify us in a sense, to not disarm us from what we are meant to be as men, but to hone our abilities into building up civilization, to protect not only the women we love, but to progenerate that for the next generations. And you can kind of see that in allegory with Enkidu and his love interest as well.
Yeah. Actually, the same thing. Talking about that woman and the idea of the woman kind of domesticating Enkidu. That's not the only instance of a woman necessarily playing
Thinking
that
of Samson?
Huh?
Thinking of Samson?
I'm thinking of a whole bunch of things. We have Hebe, who was Heracles' spouse. We have Brunhilde, which was Odin's, not necessarily bait, but he promised to wed her to the one who comes and saves her from that ring of fire. Essentially, it's that idea of being the end goal to which the hero devotes himself, in a higher sense of the word. We have here I'll read from this.
This all kind of relates to that discussion we had a few episodes ago about masculinity and femininity, gentlemanly knighthood and damehood, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, literally from the same.
This is all, what, 4,000-5,000 years ago?
Oh yeah. It is like Enkidu is Gilgamesh, and Enkidu is the first myth from way long
that we know of, because it was written down.
Yeah, the first written myth, I guess you could say. But yeah, so the woman is essentially representative of like a holy wisdom, I guess you could say. That's how Evola puts it. And he says it's a holy wisdom or a perceived embodiment in different degrees of the transcendent divine woman, who kind of represents the power of a transfiguring spirituality and of a life that is unaffected by death. And so that's essentially the same motif that you see in Gilgamesh and Enkidu's story. But it is prevalent throughout many hero stories. And so all of these mythological figures could be seen as evoking the principle of Novus Civis themselves. Siegfried or Sigurd, depending on what name you would prefer to go with, signifies Novus Civis as well in the Norse mythology of Sigurd and Brunhilde. Same thing with Hercules, or Heracles, however you would like to pronounce him. And the same thing with Horus in the Egyptian tradition. These are all significant individuals who undergo an initiation and to some degree involve a woman that either hones them or directs their focus towards one specific point. And all of this is representative of the functions of these two principles as they exist even in real life. Anybody in a relationship can attest, speaking more anecdotally, anybody in a relationship for a long period of time can attest to the same thing. If you have a spouse, if you are a man and you have a wife, definitely the wife directs your focus towards a productive and I guess you could say more holistic and more proper goal than if you were to be on your own. So it really is I guess you could say a signification of this principle in real life being understood as a symbol in a story to represent the actualization of these various principles as they exist ontologically, if that makes sense.
I mean, hey, just look at what started the Trojan War. Like, there's a bright and clear example right there.
Exactly. And
but so moving into some, because I only have about 30 minutes left.
Oh, yeah.
Moving into like some of the historic figures that we were alluding to before, and how they're the real great men throughout history that we know of that would be able to look across the aisle and come to some sort of like gentleman's understanding with each other, even if they were opposed civilizationally. They'd still have that respect and honor for one another, seeing themselves on this status like Gilgamesh and Enkidu did. Some of them being like Caesar, Charlemagne, the founding fathers, Qi Shi Huang, might have butchered his name, but that was the first emperor of China, Confucius, Mansa Musa, and Genghis Khan, just to name a few. But there are bounds and bounds more. Someone like Alexander or whomever you might see. And you can see most of them coming about from military backgrounds, because that warrior spirit that is always within man is kind of the predominating force throughout history, that nothing really happens until you have that band of paraticals, this piratical race, like what Bronze Age pervert would call this band of brothers, as you will, going out and just conquering stuff, and then not just conquering for conquering's sake, but building upon what they did conquer, and then creating a civilization that will stand the test of time well beyond their lifetimes. Right. Is something that puts them up on that Novus Civis status, because it's not just the war that they're fighting in men and numbers and quantity, and some of them aren't even warriors, some of them are thinkers too.
Yeah.
But it's this opposing of great power beyond one's individual self. And it's the inspiration of men around you to have themselves dedicated to you, to dedicate themselves to this goal that you envision, like how Caesar or Alexander or the founding fathers did, and then creating this structure around them to keep that perpetuating, to keep it focused, to keep it refined, and to really build something that transcends just the man himself.
Yeah. That really relates to what I was speaking of earlier. If you take that example of the Franks that Evola gave in his book, that could really be translated to the American situation as well. Like, I'll read it again, but I'll translate Frank to American. Let's say American was synonymous with being free, and the bearer, by virtue of one's race, of a dignity that in their own eyes made the Americans superior to all other people. Up to the 9th century, sharing the common civilization and belonging to the American stock were the foundations of the state. although there was no organized and centralized political unity coextensive with the national territory as the modern idea of a state. Later on, American quote-unquote nobility was scattered everywhere, and these separate and highly autonomous units, which still retained an immaterial connection with the center, constituted the unifying vital element within the overall connection, like the cells of a nervous system, blah, blah, blah. And you could see that their unification after the Articles of Confederation can coincide with the Carolingian development that led to the establishment of the empire. It really is that same principle. So that idea of Novus Civis being present in historic figures is very present within people like George Washington, who ascribe themselves to, while they may not be holistic or quite well thought out principles, were indeed principles that he held to be true within the situation that he found himself. Not
only that, principles they lived by.
Yeah,
because they took what they wrote down very seriously, and even if there were obstructions in each other's reign of power, like Washington going to Congress, I think that the first Congress, in saying I need these passed for, I think it was some dispute of Indians on the border of the territory, and he needed to like garner troops or something like that, and Congress said, you're going to have to wait for us to deliberate and approve it. And he was kind of pissed off about it, but they laid down the principles and he abided by them.
Yeah.
And then he relinquished that power.
Yeah.
Which is why he's held up so high.
Yes, exactly. So I guess we can start at we can start chronologically, I guess you can say. Besides George Washington, that was kind of an aside, but you can look at folks like people like Caesar. Go ahead.
Well, who's first? Mensa Musa or Caesar or Qin Shi Huang?
Well, I guess
I don't know.
Alexander the Great. I guess you can look at most of history's famous conquerors and identify Novus Civis principles within them because they were devoted to something that was beyond themselves. The story of Caesar is very much a story of an ambitious man who was very much an opportunist. At the end of all things, he devoted his life to the cause of Rome, of making Rome a better place, a less corrupt place. The officials were very corrupt, and so the things were falling apart left and right. And so he did want to be that unifying force that coalesced the more or less disorganized forces into a single unitary empire. And by virtue of his actions, he indeed had that result. But the fact that he never lived to see it and yet still made that his goal was, in a sense, what raised him to that Novus Civis status. It was that goal in its sense, and then it was aspiring to that goal and then achieving it that truly signifies him as being a historic figure that is exemplary of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, whereas Romulus was the myth that kind of founded upon, but Caesar was the actualization of that.
Yeah, definitely. And then, I guess you could look at folks like, I wanted to bring up Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, because these were two people who were at the end of the Crusades, or not the end of the Crusades, but were on either end of the fighting forces of the Crusades, who were, very much in conflict with each other, but still admired each other as warriors and as men of faith, even, two different faiths, but they respected each other. They highly respected each other. And there was a lot of correspondence between Richard the Lionheart and who was a European noble, and Saladin, who was a Muslim noble and warrior. And so their two forces fought against each other quite a lot. And at the same time, they had this big respect for each other. They had this mutual understanding that they were both warriors in a spiritual battle that wasn't necessarily understood as anything materialistic. There was this idea that there was a greater and lesser holy war going on, and the lesser war, which is the more materialistic war, was signifying that greater spiritual battle within the warriors going on. It did not matter whether it was victory or defeat, so long as that warrior principle was being actualized. That's, in a sense, what characterized their relationship. And one of the things that is kind of exemplary of this is that Richard the Lionheart fell ill, and so eventually he could not fight any longer. He could not lead any longer, and so he essentially got, I believe it was Saladin's brother, to be kind of a correspondence between the two, and he brokered a truce between the two forces, within which the various Christians and Muslims could both travel to the Holy Land, absent of any taxes or basically there was free travel between the two of them for a period of time during the Crusades, because of that respect, that mutual respect that they had for each other, that allowed that type of truce to be kind of manufactured, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I believe there was a similar sort of recognition there with Mehmed the Conqueror and Constantine the 11th as well.
Yes, I think so. I'll have to look that one up because I don't know too much about that one. The Saladin and Richard the Lionheart one is the one that I know most about. But yeah, it's the same idea being expressed across all time periods and all cultures.
I think it was that Mehmed heard that Constantine had died in the fighting in defense of Constantinople, and he ordered his men to stop the battle and not retreat, but sort of call back a little bit so that they could retrieve Constantine's body and give him proper rights to burial, because he had respect for who he was as a leader. And I mean, what can we say? We don't have our leaders and our political elite fighting on the front lines of any conflict now. They cower in their offices and just line their pockets off the expense of those they rule over. So there definitely was an honor that is long since been relinquished or extinguished from our societies, that you could say we haven't. Maybe the last light we saw of was around the Civil War period for the U.S. and in World War I for a few other nations. And since then, it's kind of just died out and devolved more and more as the decades have gone on.
Yeah. So I'll read one more passage because it really does signify the idea of the warrior spirit and of Novus Civis kind of being signified in this conqueror type of man. But he says that considering that in the traditional view of the world, every reality was a symbol and every action a ritual, the same was true in the case of war. Since war could take on a sacred character, holy war and the path to God became one and the same thing. In more or less explicit forms, this concept is found in many traditions. A religious aspect and a transcendent intent were often associated with the bloody and military deeds of traditional humanity. So that was essentially what I was talking about with the characterizing aspect of Saladin and Richard the Lionheart, the Crusades. Obviously, that's just one example, but war, in a sense, when it was fought with a traditional character, it's supposed to raise the status of the warrior to the archetypal. There's this idea that the man and the conscious even gets lost, gets kind of put into a trance state in the fulfillment of the archetypal, to where you are essentially participating in a super consciousness that is beyond your typical everyday I state. And this is kind of felt in a lesser sense. Whenever you get super concentrated onto something you're very passionate about, this has to come wholly from within, by the way. But it's, when you're super concentrated on something that you're wholly passionate about, whether it be writing or, driving even, or these little mundane tasks that can get very intellectually or emotionally fulfilling. It's feeling that on a lesser scale, or I guess it's feeling that on a greater scale, depending on what type of analogy you're making. But that is, in a sense, what Novus Civis is supposed to signify. It's supposed to signify reaching that state, doing what it is you are supposed to do.
Yeah, and kind of speaking on to wrap it all up, that devolution we've seen of this extinction of great men, as it were, as civilization goes on. I wrote a little bit of an essay really demonstrating this point. If you'd like me to read that now.
Yeah, that'd be great. Was it the one that we went over off call?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, begin. The modern world is an asylum run by patients, and the sane man is looked on as mad against the backdrop of an insane world. True virtue is in maintaining sanity amongst the mad, lest you become mad to be perceived as normal. In this, you will be attacked, medication forced upon you, your life restricted, and yourself outcast by society for refusing to conform to the psychosis. In this is revealed the deepest tragedy of man. Though we flood our vision with sights of heroes and great men, and we look upon them fondly, with a romanticism in retrospect, we hate them. We hate heroes and wish for nothing but their destruction, even as they save us. The archetype, nay, the caricature, of a hero we've brainwashed ourselves to believe in is a lie that the devil himself would be impressed by. The titans of pop culture and pastel gods who embody the ever-changing mass consensus are not heroes at all. Real heroes like Caesar or Jesus are spit upon, betrayed, demonized, and killed, despite saving us from forces that wish upon our demise, including ourselves. Woe unto thee who is Judas or Brutus, but woe still unto he whom is Peter or Antony. Traitors are the lowest form of men, true villains as they are. But bystanders embody a cowardice that transcends their convictions. Proof we hate heroes, for even when we know them and see their peril, we will deny them. Though even a worm will turn, it makes it no hero. The hero will sacrifice all that he is for the greater good, if that's for one man or all. And no thanks is given, no praise in their lifetime. They only get asked why they hadn't done more and sneered. None of us deserve a hero, and all but exceedingly few of us will be one. The hero does not care, though, for what's right is what the hero wants to do. Despite our chorus of lament, we will impede the hero, report him to the very authorities we despise and whom tyrannize us, call him a lunatic or a madman, and plead with him not to do what we can only fantasize in doing had we the courage to do so ourselves. We do not deserve heroes, and most will rightly never be saved.
I like that.
Thank you.
Oh, good.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that was all in the culmination of researching and refining what we were going to talk about this episode. I kind of had a inspiration to write all of that.
I like it. It touches upon the topic of heroism, which we probably should get into in another episode, because there's
this is kind of the culmination of that itself, because Novus Civis is of itself kind of like that hero archetype, and we did touch upon it a bit in the mythicism episode as well.
Yeah. But regardless, it is good, and it touches upon a necessary aspect of heroism, which is sacrificing yourself for a greater good, sacrificing all that you are for a common goal that is not only temporal or material, but spiritual, in a sense that it is that always was. You're sacrificing yourself for that always was.
And that very often is the least popular thing to do too.
Yes.
Which is why they're vilified.
Yes, definitely.
Ironically enough.
Yeah, most traditional ascetics as well are characterized by doing that same exact thing, by sacrificing their, in a sense, their future or their materialistic possessions that they could have had by living a more traditional life. In a sense, because of this dedication to that higher order of things that we're talking about here. So yeah, it is very well written too. It has that nice flair to it. I did enjoy that.
I guess to finally put a bow on it all, how we use this in our day-to-day lives is cherry on top to really bring home why it's important to discuss this at all.
Yeah. So I guess you could say that, in all of this, Novus Civis is truly the aspiratory nature to conform to a better version of yourself. In the most simplistic of terms, Novus Civis is that. And so the way in which that we should do this, the way in which we should go about this, is to stick to a higher ideal of ourselves. First to manifest it, first to consider yourself as you are, and consider your flaws and your weaknesses, which is in itself not an easy thing to do. And then to acknowledge that these are flaws and weaknesses themselves, and then to create a plan, to create a process by which you are going to get better. We talked about this idea of the ascending staircase on one and the descending staircase on the other hand. Look always towards that ascending staircase, that constant getting better. And this isn't necessarily to be a motivational speech type of thing, but more so a principled analysis of one's life that you can see yourself participating objectively and unbiasedly, and in order for which you truly were created, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that what we've also mentioned previously with that fake it till you make it / LARPing type of mentality, and that's ignoring negative connotations around those things. It's more or less to act in a role that you can identify, and what we're saying, like writing down your strengths and weaknesses and things like that, seems intuitive enough, seems simple enough, but it is actually harder when you really get down to the bone and think about it and really try to be that introspective person you need to be to improve yourself. Because we often ignore those negative things in the back of our mind, or the opposite, we let them consume us and then not let us actualize the potential that we could have. And so there's the constant tripping over ourselves or holding ourselves down, depending on which extreme you fall under.
Even if spreading ourselves too thin. I apologize again. Once again, there's the gardener outside that is making a whole bunch of noise. I know you're going to be able to hear it. But really, it is that adherence to an idea of making yourself better. And so, that fake it till you make it mindset is really a good idea, especially to get started with. Just, I guess the way in which you can be the Novus Civis in your life is to identify within yourself what latent desire there is to aspire to something that is qualitatively better. What does that mean? That means that what would make you, in your own eyes, a better person? Not in any moralistic sense, but in a functional sense. What would make you more productive positively and not negatively? In a sense, do some soul searching and try to ascertain what it is that you truly identify as, not in relation to something else. Not I identify as this thing in relation to this, or I can express my identity by doing this, or by owning this, or by wearing this, but cast off all external regalia. Don't identify certain certain material properties of certain things and try to incorporate it into your identity, don't even try to express your identity through those materialistic properties, but truly try to ascertain what it is that you are, what kind of principle you want to embody, and then understand the material implications or manifestations of that same principle. That's what Novus Civis truly is.
And to speak anecdotally, like what I might be doing in my own life, is, as an example, one of the weaknesses I have is face-to-face social interactions. If I were to be in a party or something like that, I'm very much the wallflower, or try to avoid those scenes altogether because it's not my cup of tea. But I realize in doing the things I do want to do and aspire to the things I do want to become, that I have to overcome some of those barriers there. And so I've been increasingly putting myself in these real-life social interactions, and the whole deal with COVID and whatnot and lockdowns has made that incredibly difficult. But now that those things have more or less gone away, it's easier to go out and reinstantiate myself in that, while also correcting some of the, I wouldn't say bad behaviors, but kind of autistic little quirks I do have in overcoming some of those pitfalls. And then knowing my strengths as well, I was always very naturally good at the arts in writing. And so I've been practicing my writing as you read here in preparation for this video, but also in practicing drawing and painting and using different mediums of art every day as well. And then culminating this into that comic I think I've mentioned previously in the myth episode, to make our own stories and our own narratives to live by in principle and use in these grand demonstrations, like the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu. And this medium I want to make as my magnum opus, my masterpiece, something I know I've always been good at, and to really challenge myself in demonstrating all of that for the world to see. And so taking things like that into consideration, look at what you know you've always been good at and had a natural inclination to, and what you've always been very bad at and might need a challenge in overcoming, especially if it will only benefit that which you're already good at, especially if it's necessary in everyday life and in making the world that better place that you need. And in that LARP / fake it till you make it thing, there's a law of the internet, as you will, that I discovered recently as well. If you're familiar with online circles, there's things like Bidoof's law or other such statistical anomalies that keep happening, and people kind of label them with a certain term, usually by the account name or the person or behavior exhibited that first saw it. This is Kess's law, where it's the overindulgence, especially online, of ironic behaviors will eventually accumulate in sincere beliefs and actualizations of those things. And that definitely happens in the negative sense, like say with the femboy trap type of deal stuff, and people will ironically post about it and then kind of get consumed by it, as the maw of the internet does. But we can apply this in the reverse, in our sense, and think of things in this ironic, post-ironic sense, especially for individuals like millennials and later gen or older Zoomers who have been imbued in this mire of irony just all throughout our lives. And that's, our humor is based off of it, our social media interactions are based off it, our personalities are in part just at the core ironic in some sense, and it's very hard being sincere or genuine. And this is a topic that the distributist often brings up, and something that he's been trying to solve in many respects as well. And I think this is part of how we do it, where embracing that irony to an extent in a positive direction will eventually get that sincerity out of us. It's kind of like a neo-romanticism. in a way where, as we discussed in the Platonic form, neoclassicism in the 18th century was kind of faded out from that form and that renaissance of the Renaissance, as it were, into the Romantic period of the early 19th century. And now, in the 21st century, it's good to bring back that Romanticism as well, and keeping in mind that Platonic form of things in companion, so that you have a genuine and sincere mode of being, as well as an aspirational goal to bring yourself out to be, to not sacrifice the world as it is for a utopia that can never be, but to always strive for something better than what we already have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely it does. And it's nice to have that anecdotal experience in there as well. Just for my 2 cents, I would probably throw mine in there as well. For me, it was always about, I guess for a long period of my life, especially the time period when I was born to when I was out of school. I guess you could say living with my parents. I lived in a sort of passivity. I lived with a sort of passivity to my life that essentially resulted in me having done nothing productive except for maybe research a few things that I was interested in and whatnot. But it seems that every bit of money that I made, every friend that I made, everything that I did back then, it didn't result in anything. And I didn't realize how drastic of an implication that was. I didn't realize how destructive that passivity was as a kid, taking everything for granted that that your parents have for you. I didn't realize how destructive that was until I moved across the country, and realized that, okay, I don't have any of the same friends that I had before. Anything that I bought back then, like a car, a computer, all of that, I don't have it. I didn't come with it. And, things like that. It wasn't until I moved across the country, a few years back, that I really understood, like, wow, okay, I lived my entire life not doing anything productive. I have nothing to show for the first, like, two decades plus some change of my life. I had nothing to show for it. And so that same idea has kicked into gear a few things since I have moved, that now almost every second that I spend awake, I spend trying to do something that is going to result in a sorry, there's a damn leaf blower outside again.
Just power through
it. Everything I do, every second that I'm awake, is spent in the action of trying to produce something that is going to have an extensive goal. So your idea of having that magnum opus being that your work that you can have that legacies you, that's the same thing that I'm kind of going with as well. It's to build a career that is going to have lasting implications, that's going to give me money that I'm going to spend on things that will qualitatively improve my life, the life of people around me, eventually provide for a family, which will have lasting implications, because that can turn into a dynasty of sorts, right?
Oh yeah.
But it's about every second being awake, contributing to an infinite modality, an infinite work that will eventually characterize something that I can leave behind, something that I will have forever. So whether that be writing a book, whether that be investing in real estate, or whether that be whatever it may be, whether it be reading a book and gathering a vast amount of knowledge that's going to help me in the future, whether that be creating YouTube videos, or even podcasts like this one, to put on the internet, to leave my mark on certain things. All of that is the time that all of that is what I spend my time doing now. And I try not to devolve into any sort of entertainment that is not productive whatsoever, because I feel like if I do that, then I'll just devolve back into that sort of passivity, which is something I don't want to do. And so that's just the baby steps that I've been taking in my life to do that same type of deal. But what really truly, I guess you could say, what really truly kicked it off was the identification of something that I wanted, was the identification of the fact that I wanted to have a lasting legacy. You know what I mean? I wanted to have something that truly defined my life in a qualitative and in a quantitative sense. And so that's what I've tried to devote a lot of my time to.
And that is the struggle of all of us in this modern day and age, whether millennial or Zoomer or soon to be Gen Alpha.
Yeah.
We're all coming up against that nihilistic wall that we have to hurdle over or that we'll just crash into. And that's why the both of us are here, and why hopefully all the listeners are here as well, in building ourselves up, in building something like Praxia, building up this methodology and refining of a culture and something to leave behind long past our own lives and even the civilizations we were born into. Hopefully what we're building here, as seemingly innocuous as it is just the first steps into creating something that could be civilizationally defining.
Definitely.
We won't know, but we're going to try anyways.
Exactly.
And that's to avoid things like this lone wolfing, nihilistic lashing out of civilization like we're seeing prop up more and more from all different avenues of life. And current events have shown that. Yeah,
definitely. But I think this is a good place to wrap it up. I know you said you had to go, so we can just kind of wrap it up here. Are you good in what we've talked about?
Yep, I'm comfortable leaving it off here. I think it was another great episode. Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Thank you for listening into this episode of the Praxist Table Talks. You could tell I'm a bit tired. If you're interested in finding out more about who we are, what we stand for, you can check out other videos on this channel. You can check out the links in the description down below. And if you'd like to get into contact with us, there are ways for you to do that too, down below in the description. But thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
My name is Vincent, and I hope to see you next time back here at the Praxist Table Talks.